What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm Ryan Thomas, your host, the only host that this show will ever have. Maybe someone will step in for me eventually, but I don't think so. I'm going to bring you guys the latest takes from yours truly on the NFL, MMA scene, the NHL, the MLB, now that the Major League Baseball season is starting. Very exciting stuff today. I'm very excited to talk about, though, an NHL topic that has gotten a lot of traction in Western New York, and that is the status of Sabres head coach Dan Bylsma. Will Bylsma stay or will he go? There's been times where I've talked about Bylsma and I have spelled his last name wrong. I might have for this title. I apologize. But I do know how to say his name, which is good, Dan Bylsma. So, very exciting stuff. Hopefully I pronounced that right. Very excited to give this take on the Thomas Take on Dan Bylsma. Should he stay? Should he go? Is Dan Bylsma really the problem? So, for those of you that kind of fell off the radar when it came to the Buffalo Sabres, and I know that there's a small percentage of people out there, I'm within that percentage. I was a diehard Buffalo Sabres fan. I watched them in the dog days with the early 2000s, post-Hasek era, where they weren't that competitive. There was the lockout. They came back with a new energy, a new set of rules, and the NHL were inflicted on the league. And they really adapted to those new set of rules probably better than any other team at that time, which is why they had the success that they had. Lindy Ruff was a real, not X's and O's, it's a football term, but he was a X's and O's hockey coach, a guy that really cared about the nitty-gritty of the game, and that mattered at that time. They had 45-win seasons, 50-win seasons, went to 2 Eastern Conference Finals in a row, were 1 game away from going to another Stanley Cup final, were a series away the next year from going to quite possibly another Stanley Cup final versus Ottawa in the President's Trophy season 06-07, and that didn't happen. And after that, slowly but surely, that next offseason, Briere and Jury were gone. Thomas Vanek got an offer sheet from the Edmonton Oilers that the Sabres had to match in order to keep their youngest, most offensive primed player on their team, a guy that was the best offensive player on that team at that time, now that Briere and Jury were then gone. You also had a new guard, so to speak, with Vanek, Stafford, Roy. We kind of rode the piggyback. We piggybacked those guys for a little while. We rode that train for a minute. And then those guys were gone, and then the tank happened, where they came up with this idea with Terry Pegula and Tim Murray, and Darcy Regier really started the process, trying to acquire as many picks as he possibly could, because the team knew that they were not going to be successful, so they wanted to trade the assets that they had and get a return on those guys. And that became the formula of the Buffalo Sabres, and it still is to this day to a certain extent. And Tim Murray is kind of driving that boat, sort of sailing that boat, so to speak. So it's been a very, very interesting process to see the Sabres go from a 50-win team 10 years ago to a team with so much youth mixed with veterans that are at the later half of their career, having, 500 seasons. And that is pretty much what they've had the last 2 years. That's what they had this year, and that's what they had last year. But there was supposed to be a progression from last year to this year. We, the fans, expected to see something better from the Sabres fans. And we did not. In some ways, we saw them regress. And when a team regresses, it is so easy. The easiest guy to blame in sports when you watch a team regress is obviously the head coach, number 1, number 2, the best player, number 3, the GM. It goes usually in that order or in another order in different cases. but it's usually those three guys. Usually the coach, usually the GM, usually the player, or usually the coach, usually the best player, or the GM, or vice versa. It usually does go in that order, though. Oftentimes it does. So you go down the line. Dan Bylsma is the head coach. He's been here for 2 years. 1 year, they weren't expected to do that well. They did okay towards the second half of the season. There weren't many teams that were better than the Sabres. Then this year 2, which is this year, they regressed in some cases. The defense slipped up. They made trades that didn't pan out. Obviously, Pesek for Kulikov did not really pan out this year. And the defense struggling allowed Lehner to be basically standing on his head, Leonard to be standing on his head. And the lines were changed to unreasonable proportions, just of epic proportion. We saw line combinations 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Way too many. There was no consistency with their lineup. And that's something that could really affect a hockey team. Chemistry, I think, is the number one word when you're talking about a good hockey team and when you're talking about a bad hockey team. If a good hockey team has chemistry, they will play well. If a bad hockey team is playing bad, it is because of the fact that they have a lack of chemistry. So that is the real problem right now. But I don't know if I can blame that on Dan Bylsma. So we'll move on to the franchise player, Jack Eichel. Jack Eichel is not in the fault for this. He's in his second season. He's not the captain. He's not the alternate captain. Not yet anyway. And he does not have the leadership role. If anything, the last guy I would point the finger at is Jack Eichel because of the fact that he has taken a leadership role in locker room interviews post deflating defeats where the Sabres are up 3 goals and they lose by 1. Jack Eichel says what the fans are feeling. He says what fans want him to say, what fans want him to hear, or what fans want to hear him say, I'm sorry. And I think that says a lot for Jack Eichel. I think that speaks volumes about the character of Jack Eichel. And I think that he's the last guy to blame. If anybody wants to throw shade at Jack Eichel, I urge them to find a better player on this team than Jack Eichel. There isn't one. So, moving on, Tim Murray. Is Tim Murray the problem? Trading for a guy like Dmitry Kulikov was not a bad decision at the time. But in hindsight, not so much a good move. He admitted as much on WGR Sports Radio 550. That was a bad move, and it hurt their team. But is Tim Murray to blame? What if I were to tell you, what if I told you, like the 30 for 30s, what if I told you that the problem is none of these guys? The problem is not Dan Bylsma. The problem might not be Jack Eichel. The problem might not be Tim Murray. The problem might not be Dan Bylsma. It might not be Dan Bylsma. I think more than anything, with this team right now, the number one problem that this team has is the fact that they are pointing the finger. Nobody is taking the onus for the problem. We're talking year 2. Do I think there is real reason that Dan Bylsma should be fired? Yes, I do. The fact that they regressed from year 1 to year 2 is not a good sign. The fact that they regressed to the point where players are beyond frustrated, that is not a good sign. But year 2, I'm not in the opinion that a guy should be fired year 2. Rex Ryan, I thought, was a little premature, but I do like the guy that they brought in afterwards. Sean McDermott, I'm a big fan of Sean McDermott. I've talked about that a lot in Bills Talk. But Sabres Talk, Dan Bylsma is dealing with a bunch of younger players, as I said, and a bunch of older players that are on the back end of their veteran career. So not a lot to really work with besides the Eichels, besides the Reinhardts, besides Kane, O'Reilly, and Okposo. Those are the Fab Five for the Buffalo Sabres. You got 5 guys that you can build a team around. Their defense is not that good. That does fall on the GM. So I can't say that they should just scrap this whole thing after 2 years when hockey is a different sport than the sport of football. We're talking about a sport that you need to have progression. You need to see progression, and oftentimes changing coaches can cause real regression with those players that are progressing, and they are progressing. But the regression of the team was due to the fact of the players that were acquired, traded, sent packing for the compensation which you received. That could be blamed on Tim Murray. I think it's way too soon to say Bylsma should be fired in year 2, but you could obviously make a case that he should be based on the record wins-loss regression that they've had, based on some of the games that they lost. But I think more than that, the problem is the players actually pointing the finger at Bylsma, because that causes a situation where I want to hear a player say, hey, we're on the ice. Bylsma is not on the ice. He's coaching us, but we are responsible for the fact that we had a 3-goal lead. We blew the 3-goal lead. We lost the game. We are playing on the ice. We are skating on the ice. We are shooting the puck, passing the puck, not Dan Bylsma. So that is what I thought I would hear from a guy like a Brian Giunta, and we did not. That is what I thought we would hear from a guy like Jack Eichel, and we did not. So the fact that Jack Eichel, the fact that Brian Giunta, the fact that Okposo, none of the big names of the team are willing to throw Bylsma some sun rather than some shade is a little bit concerning on both ends. On the fact that Bylsma is not really getting the ringing endorsements from his players, and the fact that his players are not getting the ringing endorsements. We don't know if it's Bylsma. We don't know if it's the players. We don't know if it's both. We could find out very shortly after they fire Bylsma and replace him that it could in fact be the fact that the players are young and they might not be at the veteran. They might not have the veteran attitude that veterans like Matt Molson have, guys on the team that are veterans in the league that have the NHL veteran attitude. The fact that you're dealing with a lot of top-level collegiate college players, hockey players, like Sam Reinhart in Canada, like Jack Eichel in America and Boston University, you're dealing with guys that have never lost before. So that could be the case as to why there's this consensus that Bylsma should be fired among the players, because they've never lost. The guys that are young on this team that were hotshot college prospects, they've never went through the bad. They've been through a lot of good. They never really went through the bad. When I say Reinhardt was a college prospect, he was not. He obviously played in a Canada league, I believe. And Reinhardt, Eichel was a hotshot college prospect. So, but on the World Junior stage, there were World Junior guys, and they played for their country. So now they actually are playing in the NHL, playing for the Buffalo Sabres, and things are not going according to plan, and the players do not like it. Is that Dan Bylsma's fault? I think that it's a problem that the players are pointing a finger rather than taking some responsibility. I want the players to take some responsibility for the fact that they had the season that they had. It's not all the coach. The coach is not on the ice. So for the players to kind of just shoo it off and put it on the coach, I don't like that at all. So hopefully we see Bylsma in year 3 so we can finally actually understand what the problem is, because I don't really think we know. I think the only thing we know about the problems that the Sabres have is their personnel, that they need better defense. They have one real defensive man on the team, that is Rasmus Ristolainen. Other than that, the guys are hot and cold constantly. So we need to get that defenseman in this year's NHL draft. We've loaded the offense. We haven't had the defense. Will Tim Murray bring in that guy? I think he will. And I would give Bylsma one more year so we can find out if he is actually the problem, or is it the players prematurely blaming the coach. That was the Thomas Take. Take care, guys. Thanks for listening.